Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. It's Thursday, October 17th, 2024. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Over the summer, Canada, Finland, and the United States launched the Icebreaker collaboration effort, otherwise known as the ICE Pact. Aimed at strengthening Arctic security and enhancing shipbuilding capabilities, the partnership will focus on developing polar icebreakers and fostering collaboration between the three countries. This initiative aligns with Canada's Arctic sovereignty goals, supports northern and Indigenous communities, and could potentially advance the national shipbuilding strategy in modernizing the Canadian Coast Guard and Navy fleets. To discuss the ICE Pact and its implications, we're joined by Dr. Adam Lajeunesse, Associate Professor of Public Policy at St. Francis Xavier University, President of Arctic Security Consultants, Colonel Pierre LeBlanc, and Dr. Rebecca Pincus, Director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This is the Expert Series. Hi, Adam. Good to have you back on the program. Let's get started.
To kick off the discussion, could you maybe describe the ICE Pact in a bit more detail and maybe get into what necessitated this arrangement between Finland, Canada, and the U.S.?
Sure. To start with the necessity of this, Canada and the United States in particular, Finland less so, but Canada and the United States have realized over the last decade or so that we are facing a significant shortage of icebreakers, both a shortage in what we have available to us, as well as a future shortage. So our ability to build these very complex, very expensive, heavy vessels is not where it needs to be. So it was the government of Stephen Harper that pledged to build Canada's heavy icebreaker. And of course, we are now more than a decade on from that, and we're still waiting for that to enter the water. So it takes a very long time. Our shipyards are having a hard time building these. The Americans are finding they're in the same boat. The U.S. started their building project a little bit later than us, but their shipyards are having a lot of trouble. The U.S. Coast Guard has still not approved a design. The two countries are finding just enormous difficulties in moving these projects forward. Now, the Finns have some of the most advanced icebreaker technology in the world. They have some of the best shipyards, the most experience building icebreakers. But of course, the Finns don't have the same demand that Canada and the United States do for heavy polar icebreakers. So the idea behind the pact is that the three countries can combine requirements, assets, knowledge, potentially exchange workforces, engage in joint training to smooth many of our shipbuilding woes and expedite the construction of fleets for all three nations. Now, the critical question there you started with is, what is the pact? And the best answer I can give you is we don't know yet. What we got is really a statement of intent. So the three governments would like to share technology. They would like to do something in the field of joint workforce training. Great. And they'd like to encourage other countries to purchase icebreakers from our yards. The third point is obvious. We've never stopped doing that. The first two are very general. Now, the statement of intent came out, and then that began a process by which the three countries started to negotiate an MOU on what the agreement actually looks like. So they've taken these big aspirational goals, and the real question is, how are you going to reach those? What are you going to do? What does this agreement really look like? PSPC is running the show from the Canadian perspective, but right now what our goals are, what we want this to look like, still a bit of a mystery.
In what ways will the new icebreakers contribute potentially to the defense capabilities of all of our partner nations? You've touched on this a little bit. For instance, how might they influence NATO's Arctic defense posture?
I think that's one of the great misperceptions that we've seen over the last, I'd say 20 years in the debate about Canadian Arctic security. We're all constantly talking about an icebreaker gap between ourselves, Canada, the United States, and Russia. The Russians have, an enormous fleet, much more capable, much more powerful icebreakers. The Canadians and the Americans, we are obviously not where we need to be. And people securitize this. They look at this dynamic, this discrepancy, and they say, well, this is a significant security problem. One of the things I guess that has always bugged me is they've never really gamed that out, taken it then one step further and asked, well, how is this a security problem? So we have not enough icebreakers. The Russians have this enormously. In what scenario is this a NATO issue? Is this a conventional defense issue? It's not really. This is a domestic security issue. We need these vessels. The Americans need these vessels for, for commercial support in the Arctic, for ice clearing, for resupplying communities, resupplying military bases, for science, technology, marine scientific research, for defense research, for fisheries patrol. There are all kinds of safety and security issues that we need these icebreakers for. But when you escalate it to that next level and say, well, this is an important part of our confrontation with the Russians, that's when you start to lose me. From a defense perspective, I can scarcely imagine a less capable vessel than an icebreaker. These guys are huge, highly visible, unarmed, slow. This just is not a crucial part of the Canadian-US NATO puzzle in our expanding confrontation with Russia. So for your listeners, what I would say is, these are important security assets, but be sure that you separate out safety and security from that conventional defense equation.
I'm wondering if you might be able to touch a bit more on what operational challenges Canada in particular might anticipate in the development and deployment of these icebreakers, and how we could potentially go about planning to address such challenges as they arise.
Well, as I said earlier, we've faced significant challenges in building them. Now, part of that was the national shipbuilding strategy being such an enormous undertaking. It had teething pains. It's now rolling. It's taken years and years, but it is now producing ice strength and patrol ships at the Irving yards at a rate of more than one per year. So they're doing very well. C-SPAN is now moving. Davy is just starting. That's a bit more of a big open question mark, but the NSS is finally producing. It's taken a very long time, but icebreakers are big, complex vessels. It takes a lot of effort to design them. It takes a lot of effort to get your shipyard to the point where it can build them efficiently. And one of the critical problems that both we and the Americans have faced is a lack of scale. So this enormous ship, complex, expensive, specialized workforce, we develop all of this capacity to build them, and then we build one or two, right? We just don't have the economies of scale. The Americans, the same thing. They're operating with 3 icebreakers right now, really only half of an operational icebreaker, really. So we're not building enough of them to get that economy of scale, to get that efficient, hot production line where we can start producing these vessels efficiently and less expensively. Now, hopefully, in theory, one of the great contributions of the ICE Pact will be to combine the demand of Canada, the United States, Finland, and potentially other partner and NATO nations so that we can build more efficiently, so that our shipyards have a larger order book and that they can start to see that learning curve. They can start to see on vessel 3, 4, 5, those significant decreases in, man hours to build these vessels. Look at Irving, for example. I've heard that, nothing formal, but, I've heard that the 4th and the 5th Arctic offshore patrol vessel, we're seeing somewhere between 40 and 50% saving in man hours to build these vessels because the learning curve is so clearly there. So that in principle is what the ICE Pact should develop, is building out a larger demand so that our shipyards can work together and see that improvement in efficiency.
Adam, thanks so much. Hi, Pierre. Great to have you back on the program. Let's get started.
I'm wondering if you might be able to describe a bit more for our audience, get into more detail, the specific role or roles that icebreakers generally, particularly in the Canadian context, play in the security and maintenance of the Arctic.
The Canadian Coast Guard actually doesn't guard the coast. unlike the American Coast Guard, which has a more security-focused mandate. In Canada, the Coast Guard main functions in the Arctic is really to support the annual sea lift to all the Inuit communities that can only be economically resupplied by ship because there is no roads, no bridges to those communities. In addition, the Coast Guard will obviously provide navigational aids by installing various navigational equipment in the Arctic. They support the mapping and charting of the Arctic Ocean, which is an important function. At the moment, we have only about 15% of the Arctic archipelago that is charted to modern standard. So it's important for Canada to continue to increase that number, which essentially will help also on the search and rescue. And that's another function that the Coast Guard can perform effectively in the Arctic, is search and rescue of vessels in distress or other situation where their presence and the use of their helicopter might be able to assist somebody that is in distress. One of the reasons I'm saying that charting and mapping of the Arctic Ocean is important for search and rescue is that when there is an event of a vessel in distress, the Coast Guard cannot proceed at speed to reach that vessel and provide assistance unless the charts allow them to move quickly. If the area where the vessel is in distress is not charted, the vessel of the Coast Guard will need to proceed cautiously to reach that vessel. So it cannot provide that. It cannot be moving at the highest speed possible because it would be endangering their own vehicle, their own vessel by going into an uncharted area. The last item that I would mention that the Coast Guard has responsibility for is an environmental response. The Arctic is a very fragile ecosystem. Its food chain is very short and vertical, from the zooplankton to fish to seal to polar bear. And that's basically it in terms of what the sea can provide. So you don't have the variety of food chain in the southern part of Canada that doesn't exist in the Arctic. So it's very important that whatever happens in the Arctic is done in a very cautious way to minimize the risk of an environmental incident to even happen. But if there is one, then the Coast Guard, one of their functions is to actually jump into action and minimize the impact of that incident.
I'm wondering if you might be able to get into some of the challenges of building and operating icebreakers and what some of the main challenges that Canada faces are likely when scaling up its icebreaker fleet.
I think Canada's problem is that it waited too long to invest in icebreakers as well as naval vessels. So we are reaching a point where, from a security point of view, the international community is starting to criticize Canada for not being able to really take its share of security efforts. Our vessels, all of them, are now basically past their design life. So we need to replace the surface combatants, the submarines, the icebreaker, all at the same time. So we have three major shipyards in Canada, and those shipyards are now operating basically at capacity. By joining with Finland and the US, this will allow our three nations to gain some benefit from economy of scale and the capacity to produce vessels, icebreakers specifically. So between the three countries, they can pool their resources together to be able to manufacture and build all these equipment at the same time. And it's not only when we think of an icebreaker, a lot of people look at the ship as a shell, but there's a lot of components in the vessel itself where each of the country can bring some of their best capabilities to bear. Canada doesn't really have a radar building capability, whereas the US does. Finland has a lot of experience in building icebreakers. So, when you consider many of the components that are going to be inside of those icebreakers, such as simple as doors, windows, pumps, and so on, a lot of these equipments could be combined in terms of procurement, manufacturing, and the ability of limited spare parts, because now you have three nations that all have the same equipment. Interoperability comes into play. And that's an important factor, especially when we throw in NATO into the picture. For those ships to be able to communicate, to be able to integrate their radar signals together, to be able to be fixed in any of the countries, because all of the countries have the tools, the spare parts, the equipment to be able to do repairs. So there's a lot of advantages in pooling the resources of these three nations and their core competences to collectively build new modern icebreakers with the latest technology. The Coast Guard the U.S. Coast Guard has not been building icebreakers for decades now, so they've lost the know-how, if you wish, the real technical knowledge required to build to modern standards those vessels. So by combining the expertise of the three countries, and Canada has been building those icebreakers to some extent, through the Arctic offshore patrol vessels. They've developed the capability to assemble those vehicles, those vessels. So there's a lot of infrastructure that was invested to get those vessels built, and that will now play into replacing the fleet of icebreakers, not only for Canada, but also Finland and the US. I'll mention the fact that certainly the US is very keen on having heavy icebreakers, because part of the function that their Coast Guard does is the support of science in Antarctica, which requires the heavier icebreakers. Canada plans to have at least one heavy icebreaker to operate in the Arctic. Finland probably has a lesser requirement because the Barents Sea doesn't have the same kind of ice that we have in the Arctic, especially when you're looking at second-year ice, third-year ice, which are obviously thicker and heavier and harder to go through than the one that you would see in the Barents Sea.
Pierre, thanks again for joining us. Dr. Pincus, great to have you on the program. Why don't we get started?
Could you maybe outline a bit more what the Pact seeks to accomplish in terms of alliances? And perhaps you could also touch on maybe the importance of icebreakers and some of the other capabilities which are the focus of the Pact.
So there are three parts to this ICE Pact agreement. The first one is information sharing. And, I'll talk more about each one of them in detail. But so the first one is information exchange. The next one is sort of a collaboration on workforce development. And then the third one is this sort of open invitation to allies and partners to purchase icebreakers built by the US, Canada, and Finland. So I think, this agreement grew out of the situation in the United States, which is really a crisis in terms of where we are at with U.S. icebreaker capabilities and capacities. The U.S. has two icebreakers right now, the Polar Star, which was built in the 1970s, and the Healy, which was built in the 1990s. Just a couple weeks ago, the Healy suffered a pretty significant fire while it was up in the Arctic. And the Polar Star is obviously a very elderly ship. So this is, the lowest point for the U.S. icebreaker fleet in many decades. And the U.S. Coast Guard, which operates American icebreakers, has got a program underway to build more icebreakers called the Polar Security Cutter Program, but it is really in crisis in terms of timely delays and cost overruns. And so I think this agreement probably grew out of the crisis in the United States. And it's not just icebreakers. I kind of want to zoom out a little bit here. Yes, the US has a crisis on its hands when it comes to the icebreaker fleet, but we're in a real pickle when it comes to shipbuilding writ large. So, whether it's Coast Guard or the Navy or even civilian shipping or merchant marine, the US is not building enough ships fast enough as it needs to. And so I think we're seeing a fair amount of policy innovation to try to get more ships faster across the board. And I think I would put this ICE Pact kind of in that broader context. The three components that I mentioned at the top, the information sharing, workforce development, and sort of encouragement for purchasing, I think are interesting because they are sort of sidestepping the main debate in the United States over how much support to give to our shipbuilding industry. A question of where to set industrial policy in terms of subsidies or protection. These three components of the ICE Pact really sort of sidestep that question in favor of, I think, easier targets. Information sharing, again, we don't know what those details are, but hopefully it will, improve expertise, and maybe there'll be some experiences shared back and forth. Obviously, Canada is building icebreakers right now, and Finland is the world leader in the construction of icebreakers. When it comes to workforce development, I think that's really, really promising. One of the major constraints that the United States faces in terms of shipbuilding in that broader context is labor. And in particular, when it comes to icebreakers, which require specialized expertise, most of which has been lost in the US, we are really behind the curve. And so if there's any way in which Canada and Finland can help build the workforce skills and expertise in the US, that will be fantastic. And then the last piece, encouraging allies and partners to buy icebreakers. Again, I'm not sure where that's going to go, but it is interesting to kind of see those three components to this agreement.
I'll note that a few years ago, there was the AUKUS announcement of which Canada was excluded, and Canada from its allies, including our friends in the United States, have been critical of our defense spending levels. So with this in mind, and also considering the upcoming CUSMA review, I'm wondering if this new pact spells maybe a positive development in the Canada-US relationship. I'm wondering if you might be able to offer any comment on that.
Great question. I think there is a fair amount going on right now. Obviously, Canadian defense spending has been an issue with the NATO summit recently. I know Canada has talked a lot about AUKUS. I think it's, at least from my perspective, and again, I'm speaking from Washington, D.C., so I'm making these comments as an American. It feels to me like Canada is going through a bit of an inflection point when it comes to its security and defense policy and making some really tough choices. There was the recent announcement about buying submarines, which I think is really interesting. Obviously that comes in the context of attention to the 2% level. There's the ongoing conversation about NORAD recapitalization. Again, there have been announcements about some pretty significant investments, but we haven't seen progress. I I was surprised by the submarine announcement. I've been a little bit surprised about all the furor over AUKUS because it feels like Canada is sort of trying to be everything all at once when it comes to sort of security and defense. And I think there do have to be some tough choices about where to make investments because all of these things are incredibly expensive, whether it's, radar systems for NORAD, submarines, ships. They're all tremendously expensive, not only to build, but to maintain and operate, right? I mean, this is the question with that submarine announcement. How are those ships going to be crewed and maintained, and in what shipyards? So I think that's a problem that we have in the United States as well. The Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard is cutting missions and cutting ships because it doesn't have enough sailors to crew them. I think there's sort of this holistic look right now where a lot of countries, the US and Canada included, need to think about sort of designing a military that is fit for purpose. And I think that can drive some really tough choices.
I think for those listening who might not be familiar with this topic, they might be surprised to learn that the United States has only 2 icebreakers and that they're relatively old and experiencing problems. At least from the Canadian perspective, keeping in mind that the U.S. spends quite a significant amount on its defense budget. How exactly did we get to a situation where not to sound rude or anything, but where the United States only has these 2 icebreakers? It sounds like something that would be more of something you'd associate maybe with Canada.
I know it's absurd, right? It's been this long-standing problem, and there's a number of different drivers, but mostly it's because the icebreakers are operated by the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Coast Guard is not part of the Department of Defense. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security, and its entire budget is about, $12 billion. And to build an icebreaker in the United States is almost, the first one in the class, obviously the more you build, the cheaper they get, but the first one is, $7 or $8 or $900 million. So almost $1 billion. So we're talking, close to 10% of the budget. And that is just like, a snake swallowing an elephant. It just does not work in a standard kind of budget cycle. And Congress has not been able to produce the sort of large scale authorizations, appropriations that would kind of get the Coast Guard over that hurdle. There is a program underway now, as I mentioned, the Polar Security Cutter program, but it has been really delayed and experienced a lot of cost overruns because it's been so many decades since we've built an icebreaker. So at this point, it's sort of like the longer you wait to do something hard, the harder and more expensive it gets. And structurally, the Coast Guard does not have kind of the scale of budgets, like the Navy shipbuilding budget is so big, right? It's just a very different kind of environment. The U.S. Coast Guard usually builds much less costly platforms.
I'm wondering if you might be able to delve into how the ICE Pact might align with broader U.S. defense or security strategies or ambitions in the Arctic, particularly within this context of rising global maritime competition. We're seeing China claim that it's an Arctic state. Russia obviously is very invested in the Arctic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Department of Defense just put out a new Arctic strategy a few weeks ago, and it talks a lot about, engaging with allies and partners. That's been a pretty consistent message across the last 2 strategies. And I think it really affirms that, what the U.S. competitive advantage against China globally is our network of allies and partners. And we're incredibly lucky to have strong, capable partners like Canada and other Arctic states who are all certainly, we've a tremendous set of NATO partners in the Arctic. And that's great. And so I think this ICE Pact is sort of an example of let's lean into that space. The US is having trouble building icebreakers. Let's work more closely with our allies who are good at it. So I think it's fantastic. I think it's a recognition of sort of the stakes of competition at this point. And again, I would put this in the broader context where the US is having a shipbuilding problem across the Navy and the Coast Guard. China is building ships incredibly fast of all kinds, military and civilian ships. And, we have to move quickly and be creative in terms of sort of finding new solutions, because we cannot permit the current situation to proceed. We're being outcompeted when it comes to shipbuilding. And so I think this is driving the identification of some of these new and kind of creative approaches like you see in ICE Pact.
Dr. Pincus, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for making some time to speak with us. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to our guests.